I thought my siblings came to our father's funeral to mourn, until I caught my brother searching through Dad's desk for a power of attorney while the guests were still in the living room. My name is Arthur, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived in a quiet county in Ohio my whole life. My father, Thomas, passed away last autumn at 89. He spent 40 years laying bricks and working construction. He was a quiet, hard-working man who never wore a fancy suit, never drove a shiny car, and never bragged about money to the rest of our town. Thomas was just the sweet old man sitting on his front porch, waving as pickup trucks drove by. But to my brother Julian and my sister Evelyn, he was something completely different. To them, he was just 50 acres of valuable riverfront property waiting to be divided. For 5 years, Dad lived in his old timber frame house near the valley. His health was failing, his legs were weak, and his hands trembled whenever he tried to lift a coffee mug. I moved in with him to handle his daily care, cooking his meals, managing his medication, and keeping him company during those long, quiet evenings. Julian and Evelyn, they vanished. Julian lived 20 minutes away in a gated golf community, driving a luxury European sedan, but he was always too busy with corporate meetings to visit. Evelyn only called when her credit cards were maxed out and she needed a financial bailout. I never complained. I loved my father. Sitting on that porch, listening to his stories from the old days, was enough for me. But 3 days before he passed, Dad did something that made my blood run cold. He was sitting in his armchair by the window, breathing heavily. He motioned for me to come close, his trembling hand gripping my forearm. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look out toward the old barn across the road. Is that blue pickup truck still parked there?" I pulled the curtain back. Parked under the shadows of the maple trees was an old Ford truck. A man in a navy work jacket was sitting inside, staring toward our house. He wasn't a neighbor, and I had never seen his face before. "Dad, who is that?" I asked, feeling a sharp knot form in my stomach. Dad took a slow, painful breath. "That's Marcus, Arthur. He's been keeping an eye on things at night. Just make sure Julian doesn't see him." Before I could ask what was going on, Dad reached under his blanket and handed me a small brass key along with a heavy yellow envelope sealed with red wax. "Do not break this seal," Dad warned, looking straight into my eyes with an intensity one hadn't seen in years. "The moment I pass away, take this straight to Judge Harrison at the probate office downtown. Hand it directly to him. No middleman, no city lawyers. Only Harrison." 2 days later, Dad passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral service was small, but while the local pastor was speaking in the living room, I noticed Julian was nowhere to be found. I walked down the dim hallway toward Dad's private study. The door was slightly open. I peeked inside and stopped dead in my tracks. Julian was on his knees, frantically searching through Dad's locked wooden filing cabinet. Papers scattered all over the rug. "What are you doing in here, Julian?" I asked, stepping into the room. Julian jumped, his face turning red. "What does it look like, Arthur?" Dad owned 50 acres of prime river land. Commercial developers have been bidding on that land for 2 years. I'm looking for his original power of attorney and property deeds before you try to claim everything. I stared at my brother in utter disbelief. Dad wasn't even in the ground yet, and all Julian could think about was real estate ownership and cash. "Dad's affairs are taken care of, Julian," I said quietly, keeping my hand buried in my coat pocket where the brass key was hidden. Evelyn walked in right behind him, her arms crossed. "Don't play dumb with us, Arthur," she sneered. "You've been living here rent-free. We know you were influencing him." Julian already spoke to a probate lawyer in the city. "We are filing an emergency petition tomorrow to freeze all assets and force a court sale of the land." They didn't care that our father was gone. They just wanted their payout. That night, after the guests left, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the wax-sealed envelope. As I moved Dad's old desk lamp to clean up the papers Julian had scattered, I noticed a small wooden panel behind the bottom drawer had been pulled loose. Curious, I pulled the panel back and found an old leather ledger and 3 bank draft receipts. When I opened the ledger, my jaw dropped. It contained bank statements from the last 2 years. Julian and Evelyn had been using an old joint account from Dad's early pension days to quietly siphon off over $40,000, forging his signature on medical reimbursement checks while he was too weak to check his mail. They weren't just waiting for him to die, they had already been stealing from him while I was staying up all night nursing him back to health. My chest tightened with rage. Just then, I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway outside. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The man in the navy work jacket stepped into the light. Up close, his hands were calloused and his face was lined with hard work. "I didn't mean to startle you, Arthur," he said quietly, pulling off his cap. "My name is Marcus. How do you know my name? And why have you been watching this house?" I demanded. Marcus swallowed hard. 12 years ago, I was broke, sleeping in my truck behind the old feed store. Your father found me, gave me a job repairing his timber barns, paid for my trade school, and treated me like family when everyone else gave up on me. Everything I own today is because of Thomas. I listened, completely stunned. Dad had never mentioned this to anyone. Marcus looked toward the dark road. "Thomas called me 3 months ago, Arthur. He noticed money missing from his pension statements and knew Julian was forging his name. He knew his health was failing, and he was terrified. Julian would try to declare him mentally unfit to seize the river land. He asked me to park across the road a few nights a week, just to make sure no unauthorized lawyers or surveyors were coming onto the property." A wave of clarity washed over me. Dad wasn't confused or helpless in his final months. He knew exactly what his children were doing, and he was quietly preparing his defense. Early the next morning, I drove straight to the county courthouse downtown, holding the brass key, the leather ledger, and the sealed yellow envelope. Judge Harrison was a respected probate judge with silver hair who had known my father for 30 years through the local farming board. When I entered his private office, he stood up and offered his condolences. "Arthur, Thomas was one of the most honest men this county ever saw." "Thank you, Judge," I said, laying the sealed envelope and the forged bank receipts on his desk. "Dad gave me this 3 days ago and told me to bring it straight to you." Judge Harrison's warm expression turned serious. He picked up his brass letter opener, carefully sliced through the thick red wax seal, and pulled out a stack of certified legal documents alongside a small white envelope. He read through the pages in complete silence for 10 full minutes. The only sound in the office was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Judge Harrison lowered the papers, took off his reading glasses, and looked at me with deep respect. "Arthur, your father was 10 steps ahead of them," the judge said softly. "What is it, Judge?" 6 months ago, Thomas came to this office with his attorney. Judge Harrison explained. He established an irrevocable living land trust, transferring the entire 50-acre river property out of his personal name completely. 2 weeks later, the preliminary hearing took place at the county probate court. Julian and Evelyn walked into the courtroom looking entirely smug, accompanied by their high-priced city lawyer. They looked at me sitting alone at the defense table with absolute condescension, believing they were hours away from forcing a public auction. Judge Harrison took his bench and struck his gavel twice. "We are here regarding the emergency petition filed by Julian and Evelyn Miller to freeze the estate of Thomas Miller," the judge announced. Julian's lawyer stood up immediately, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, my clients request an immediate court order to liquidate the river parcel, claiming the deceased lacked mental capacity in his final months." Judge Harrison held up his hand, shutting the lawyer down instantly. "That petition is dismissed with prejudice." Julian's lawyer froze. "On what grounds, Your Honor?" Before his passing, Thomas Miller legally transferred the entire 50-acre property into a certified land trust, Judge Harrison stated firmly. "And I have the recorded deed right here." The courtroom fell dead silent. Julian turned pale. Evelyn sat up straight, her hands shaking. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and read directly from my father's handwritten letter attached to the trust. "To my children, Julian and Evelyn, you spent the last decade chasing wealth, forgetting that family is built on loyalty and care, not money. You stole from my pension while I was sick, and you abandoned your brother Arthur to bear the full burden of my care alone. Therefore, the 50 acres of river land will never be sold to commercial developers. I have permanently deeded the entire parcel to the county as a protected nature preserve bearing our family name. It can never be bought, sold, or built upon for profit by anyone." Julian jumped out of his chair, his face contorted in rage. "That land is worth millions. He couldn't do that, Judge." Harrison slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed off the wood paneling. "Sit down and be silent. I am not finished." Julian collapsed back into his seat, trembling. The judge continued reading. "To my son, Arthur, you stayed by my side when I had nothing to give you but old stories and a quiet home. You showed me love without ever asking for a single dollar. To you, Arthur, I leave the family home, all remaining savings, and full ownership of our homestead." Judge Harrison paused, looking over his glasses at Julian and Evelyn, who looked completely crushed. And finally, the judge said, holding up the white envelope, "Thomas left this instruction regarding the funds. Julian and Evelyn siphoned from his account." The judge read the final note. "I have documented every forged check. If Julian and Evelyn attempt to contest this trust, the executor is instructed to immediately file criminal fraud charges with the county prosecutor." Julian and Evelyn gathered their papers in absolute humiliation and rushed out the back doors of the courtroom without looking back. Their greed had left them with nothing but heavy legal fees, public disgrace, and the threat of criminal charges. As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I saw Marcus waiting by his truck. He didn't ask about the money or the land. He just walked up, shook my hand, and said, "Justice was done for Thomas today, Arthur." I drove back to the old wooden house on the hill, made a fresh cup of coffee, and sat out on the front porch. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet, safe, and completely at peace. Dad had protected us until the very end, leaving behind a legacy of honor, justice, and true love.